If you've ever had the experience of knowing something and then talking yourself out of it, or feeling clear and then immediately questioning whether that clarity is even real, that's not random. And it doesn't point to a lack of intuition. It's what happens when what you're experiencing is misidentified in real time. By the time someone says, "I don't trust my intuition," a pattern has already formed. There have been moments when something felt clear, accurate reads on situations, people, decisions. But those moments didn't hold. They were questioned, reinterpreted, replaced. What develops is hesitation around what to do with what you're noticing. If you take what we've talked about so far, multiple inputs, no structure for working with them, overwhelm, override, there's another layer underneath all of that. And it's this. What you're experiencing isn't being identified clearly enough to work with. Not everything you feel is the same kind of information. When it all gets grouped together, it starts to behave unpredictably. You might have a physical reaction, an emotional response, a stream of thought, a quieter sense of knowing. Each of these has its own quality, a different pace or level of stability, a different relationship to action. And when they're treated as one thing, they lose definition. And without definition, it becomes difficult to rely on what you're experiencing. Sometimes it feels strong. Sometimes it fades quickly. Sometimes it contradicts itself. The natural conclusion becomes, I can't rely on this. The inconsistency is coming from interpretation, not from the input itself. For example, you're making a decision. You feel something tighten in your body. At the same time, your mind starts generating reasons why it might still make sense. You also feel concern about how it might affect someone else. And somewhere underneath that, there's a quieter sense of direction. All of this happens in the same moment. If the entire experience gets grouped together under one label, it reads as unstable. Some of it is steady. Part of it is reactive. Some of it is interpretive. Without separation, it shows up as a contradiction. Here's another version of this. You have a clear initial reaction to something. It's immediate, simple. There's no internal debate. And then, almost immediately, a second layer appears. Questions, doubts, reframing. You begin reviewing it, looking at it from different angles, trying to make sure nothing is being missed. That second layer often carries more authority. It sounds like reasoning. It sounds like caution. It sounds like careful thinking. So even when the first response is clean, the second one feels more appropriate to follow. This shift happens quickly enough that the second layer can feel like the real response. The first one gets absorbed into it or disappears from view. This is where second guessing comes from. It's not a lack of clarity. It's a lack of distinction between different kinds of clarity. There are a few consistent ways this plays out. Without going into great depth, something reactive gets treated as direction. Something external gets experienced as internal. Something quiet gets set aside because it doesn't explain itself. Each of these changes how the experience is read. Once that happens, consistency breaks down. You're no longer working with like-for-like information. Trust builds through repetition. You notice something, you follow it, you see what happens. That sequence creates stability. Not because every outcome is perfect, but because there's a clear relationship between perception and result. When interpretation isn't clear, that sequence gets interrupted. You notice something and then pause. You reconsider. You adjust. You look for something that feels more certain or more explainable. That delay shifts the entire process. Now, you're no longer following the original input. You're working with something that has already been modified. Even when things resolve well, it becomes harder to trace it back. The connection weakens. You might notice something clearly, a sense not to move forward or a sense that something isn't aligned. And then you hesitate. You give it more time. You gather more information. You check again from a different angle. Eventually, you override it or dilute it. Later, when the situation unfolds, you can see the initial perception was accurate. It doesn't register as stable because it wasn't followed cleanly. So instead of reinforcing trust, it reinforces hesitation. This shows up in smaller ways too. You might get a clear sense not to say something and then say it anyway. Goodness knows I do that a lot. Or to leave something alone and then re-engage. Or to pause and then move forward quickly instead. Afterwards, there's recognition, quiet, direct. You knew. It just didn't translate into action. This connects directly to what we talked about last week. When multiple inputs create pressure and there's no structure, override becomes the default way of resolving that pressure. Repeated often enough, something shifts. You begin to trust the override more than the original input. The override leads to movement. It creates decisions and forward motion. The original perception starts to feel less reliable simply because it isn't being used. So the issue isn't, I don't have intuition. It's, I don't have a consistent way to interpret what I'm experiencing. There is a way to tell the difference between what is clear, reactive, what belongs to you, and what doesn't. We're not going into that here. Without that level of distinction, though, everything stays mixed. There's another pattern that shows up here. When the interpretation isn't clear, the tendency is to look for certainty. And certainty often comes from narrowing, one explanation, one conclusion. That narrowing creates relief. It reduces internal friction. It also removes information. When your field is open, there's usually more than one possibility present at the same time. When that range disappears too quickly, something has been excluded. What remains feels simpler, but it's also less precise. So what feels like second guessing, confusion, inconsistency follows a specific pattern. Different types of input grouped together, misread, and then overridden when they don't align. If you want to start getting clearer on how this shows up for you, the first step is identifying how your intuition actually comes through. I created a quiz that helps you see your primary pattern, what else is influencing it, and why certain situations feel more confusing than others. It's linked below. Once you can see what you're working with, it becomes much easier to understand what you're actually experiencing.